Well, hello and welcome back to another Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Those of you who may not be familiar with who we are and what we do, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint was formed about, 4.5 years ago. Really started around the issue of restraint and seclusion in schools around the country. But it's really much more than that. We obviously don't want to see things like restraint and seclusion happening anywhere that can be prevented. And of course, it's broader than restraint and seclusion. Even in schools, it's restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, often all the things that are being done to kids very often in the name of behavior. We are proponents of bringing about change, bringing out changes in laws and policies, but also in education. What are the better things we can do to better support students, teachers, and staff? What can we do to better support individuals working across many different settings? And those are things like bringing in trauma-informed approaches, bringing in neuroscience-aligned approaches, approaches that are based on relationships and collaboration. So we do a lot of work around education, law and policy, and of course, individual support. As you may know, we do a lot of these live events every 2 weeks. In fact, recently, we've been doing them even more often. We've had a couple of great kind of add-on events that we've done recently. But we do these events every 2 weeks, and we interview lots of amazing people. We talk to experts, we talk to educators, we talk to families, we talk to self-advocates. We talk to people that are out there helping to bring about positive change in the world. And it's a great opportunity to learn some things, to meet some people, and just to spend a little time together and hopefully have a really positive time. So today, we're very excited to have another guest with us. Liora Schwartz is joining us. Liora is a coach and licensed social worker that guides parents and professionals working with differently wired children. While today we're going to be talking about trauma-informed and neurodevelopmentally sensitive approaches that can be used to guide parents and professionals, I think we'll have a lot of topics to cover, and I'm going to introduce Liora here in a second. Our session today is, of course, being recorded, as always. So all the time, every time we do these sessions, they are recorded. You can go back later and watch them on YouTube, LinkedIn. We also have them on Facebook. You can also listen to them as our audio podcast. So our podcast is available, an audio version of this is available on Spotify, on Apple Music, on Google, wherever you might listen to podcasts. So with all that said, we're excited to have you here today. If you are a frequent flyer here on the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series, you know what I'm going to ask you next. And what I'm going to ask you next is, if you are watching us live, let us know in the chat who you are and where you're from. We always love to see we have a lot of regular attendees that come and join these every other week. We also love to meet new people as well. We'd love to know where you're joining us from and who you are. So tell us in the chat who you are and where you're from. And with that, let's get to the good part here, because you're not here just to listen to me. You get to listen to me all the time. You're here because we have a special guest. And I want to go ahead and introduce Liora Schwartz, who has over 2 decades of experience in the trenches of New York City public schools, and is a parent of a complicated, brilliant, and neurodivergent teen. I love that description. As such, she has had a unique perspective that's broadened outside of many traditional boxes. Liora's work has been with parents, professionals, and really aims to be trauma-informed and neurodevelopmentally sensitive, and is informed both by current research and lived experiences of autistic advocates. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, has a master's in social work. And before we started here, I told Liora what I always tell my social worker friends, which is the social workers are the nicest people in the world. And yet I've yet to be proven wrong on that. And I think you'll find that to be true again today. But lots of experience, has gone through Dr. Lori Desautel's Applied Educational Neuroscience program, which many of you know we're huge proponents of, and it's a fantastic program. Has a lot of experience in trauma-informed approaches. Is really kind of a commitment to looking at systems of oppression and intersections of power within race, gender, identity, ability. A lot of background with PDA, pathological demand avoidance, and we have some connection there as well. So really excited to have you joining us today. So thank you so much for being here, and we're really excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here and to chat with you as well.
Great. So again, if you're on the chat, feel free to weigh in and say hello and tell us where you're from. I see a number of people on already. I see somebody here from Connecticut, Deana Schmidt from Connecticut, taking you on a much needed walk. Well, it's great to be able to go mobile. So I'm glad that people can take us and listen to us on the go. So that's fantastic. And hopefully we'll get a couple of other people here to join in here in a second. So I gave some background on who you were. And of course, I think this conversation probably got planned almost 9 months ago, and I think you and I had a conversation, and that conversation led to, oh wow, love what you're doing, love what you believe, love the things that you're bringing forward. You should join me on the podcast sometime. I'd love to have you. And of course, suddenly time goes by, and you're like, oh, JP, I've got that event coming up in a week, right? What are we doing? What's it going to be all about? But as I told you, we're going to have a conversation and hopefully have some fun here. And along the way, the hope is that people might learn a few things as well and learn a little bit about your experience. So thank you so much again for being here today, and excited to kind of dive in.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat a bit.
So why don't you begin by kind of giving me an idea of what it is that you do today? I know that you work with parents. I know that you've also worked with professionals. What is your area of focus today?
Yeah, these days I've been doing a lot of work with parents, and I do a fair amount of parent coaching. Mostly, not all, but mostly a lot of people who find me have kids who fit this PDA profile that you mentioned.
And just for people that might not know, will you talk a little bit more about what the PDA profile is, just to give people a little bit of background?
The more clinical definition of PDA is pathological demand avoidance. However, lots of autistic self-advocates have sort of renamed it pervasive drive for autonomy or persistent desire for autonomy. There's a few different names floating around out there, but essentially it's a neurotype, usually considered under the autism spectrum, a particular sort of type of brain wiring where kids and adults who fit this profile really have a very hypersensitive nervous system response. So they're getting, hijacked into that fight, flight, freeze response according to moments of having lots of demands put on them or feeling like they don't have agency and autonomy. These folks are wired to feel in control and to feel like they have agency. And when that feels threatened, they go into a really intense response. So as you can imagine, kids in schools, all people do is tell them what to do all day long. Right. And so oftentimes, one of the biggest challenges for the parents that I work with is helping their kids to be able to access education.
Mm-hmm. And tell me a little bit more about, PDA, my understanding, and I know you've got a lot more experience than I do in this area, but, it's been recognized. In fact, it's not really even officially recognized over here in the United States, kind of from a diagnostic point of view, right? But there's a growing movement of kind of recognizing that difference. How do people begin to understand? Because we know well that many kids are looked at as a summation of behaviors, right? People don't really go beneath the surface to figure out what's really going on. So how do parents even begin to understand that they might have a child that might fit the PDA profile? What do parents see, or what do we see in schools that lead people down that road to think, I wonder, or when might you say to a parent, like, are you aware of PDA?
Yeah, I mean, nowadays there's a lot more visibility around PDA in the US. I think as you said, it does not have its own diagnostic code in the DSM, but more and more clinicians and diagnosticians are sort of recognizing and able to name it as part of a diagnosis. And so it is getting more recognition in the US, and most of the research that's out there comes from the UK and other places in Europe. But, parents find me or find other folks in the PDA spaces when all of the advice that they've been given by many different professionals doesn't work and in fact backfires. So a lot of the the behavioral type of interventions, building incentive programs and point systems and color systems and all these things, and introducing consequences, those things don't work for these kids. There's no kind of Scooby snack that is attractive enough to get you out of your hijacked sort of fight or flight brain state, right? You're not accessing the sort of parts of your brain that think about consequences and outcomes and so forth when you're in that state. And so a lot of times parents come, and this was true of myself too, as a parent of a PDA, or don't come to find this until you've sort of exhausted all the more sort of traditional parenting techniques and disciplinary approaches. Nowadays, I'm getting much more larger numbers of parents are coming to me whose kids are much younger, 4, 5, 6, because they're hearing about it. It's out there, and it's an approach that feels like it matches their kids, in a way. And so many of these kids previously were receiving diagnoses of things like ODD, which is problematic in a number of ways, right?
Absolutely.
Defiant. Typically, there's a reason for oppositionality and defiance, right? And so really more people are trying to look underneath, well, this kid is just defiant, but really trying to understand, well, what is it underneath that's causing that behavior? What's the underlying stressor that's happening? So yeah, I mean, parents often find me after they've done some of that work, but when you're using more traditional parenting techniques and offering incentives and so forth, and it's not helping your kid, that might be a real clue. You need to look outside the box a little bit and look more towards nervous system regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way you put that. And it's interesting because we might share this idea, but my thought is that a lot of these traditional behaviorism rooted approaches aren't really working for a lot of kids. And I think the kids that need our help the most is where these things work the least. And the kids that maybe they appear to work for probably don't need them. So I mean, there's a lot around the approaches that are common, and of course, I lived through this as well, where the behavior tracking sheets and the star charts and the clip charts and the incentives and the rewards, and I could think back to probably some of the most difficult days my son had at school, and trace it back to a behaviorally driven intervention that went wrong. Trace it back to a behavior tracking sheet that when the kid realized that by 10 o'clock that their whole day had not earned them the points, and then kind of went off the rails. So a lot of these approaches aren't working, I think, for a lot of kids, but some kids are really having kind of probably intense responses to them, right? So that when they're kind of moved into that fight or flight, I mean, what happens? That cortex is going offline and that kid's dysregulated. So it's often probably, I guess, then through the behaviors that that people are looking for that help. And how many try? I mean, it's good to hear what you're saying about like more awareness and more people beginning to reach out. But how many people do really go through a lot of things, a lot of effort. I was reading a book recently, Low Demand Parenting, and in that book, kind of like listening to the journey of like, here's all these things we tried, and then of course as a parent, you feel like I'm a failure. So all of this. So by the time somebody connects with you, and hopefully that's happening earlier and earlier. Where do you begin? I mean, where do you be? And I know we're kind of going down this PDA, direction right now, and we'll get back to some other things here as well. But, I think much of this is applicable to a lot of kids that I think are neurodivergent and, have stress response systems that may be, more sensitive than others, and experiences, even including trauma, that lead to that. So where do you begin when a family comes to you? And talk to us a little bit about like what your approach and what your coaching looks like.
Yeah, I think what you were just saying about, all kids maybe need this. I feel like
Yeah.
my experience and what I say so frequently to parents is that kids who fit this profile sort of demand a certain approach,
Right.
but that approach is actually really helpful for all kids, right? That approach is an approach we should take for all kids. And the approach is, number one, thinking about nervous system regulation and regulatory states, which means we have to look at the nervous system of the adults that are surrounding that kid, whether it's a
Mhm.
teacher, a para, an aide, parents. When kids are having certain behaviors, are we getting really triggered by it and we're activated, in which case we're further activating their nervous systems because our
Mhm.
nervous
So
systems are always in
yeah,
communication.
let me push on that a little bit and say, um, you say that, and I'm with you, and I'm like, yeah, yeah, yep, right on. It's understanding their stress responses as the adult understand, but how do you begin this conversation? And let's take a step back to say a parent that like this is all new world to. I mean,
Mhm.
they grew up with lots of rewards and consequences. They grew up maybe getting spanked. They grew up with a lot of other things. So how do you begin to bring some of this brain science to a parent that initially might not have any knowledge basis for this? So what's that conversation look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can start with real basics of sort of
Mm,
explaining the regions of the brain and how brains develop in childhood and throughout adolescence and even our 20s, and sort of understanding polyvagal theory and making that feel really accessible in sort of language, everyday language. And also, I mean, the truth is, I say, well, if you're trying these other approaches that they worked fine with you, I mean, that's how I was raised as well, with a sort
right,
of very traditional behaviorist kind of approach. Like, how's that working out for you? Like,
right, right,
oftentimes you're coming to me because it's not working, right? And your kid is miserable and maybe making other people around them miserable because their behaviors can be really inflammatory. And so, we really sort of look at like what's working and what's not working. And as you said, sometimes some kids, that those sort of incentivizing things can really work. And so I don't paint with a broad brush. I really want to look at, for each particular family, what's the dynamic, what's happening with you, what's working with your kid, and where are you stuck.
mhm,
And and I say the same thing. I do a lot of training for teachers and school staff and other folks, mental health staff working with kids, is really trying to just look at the data, look at what you're seeing. Behavior is communication, we
right.
know this. And so what's underneath.
Right, right, right. Yeah, it's funny you say that behaviors communication, what's underneath, because I go back to like, yeah, behaviors communication, but what's underneath behaviors biology, right? There's so much more at play here in our behavior that we sometimes, if you think you can simplify it to a sticker chart or a consequence, I mean, there's so much more. I mean, there's hormones, there's dopamine, there's stress response system, there's
Yeah.
all of these things that happen. And it really is. I mean, to think that everything can be, like you said, solved with a Scooby snack, it's just an oversimplification of kind of really dramatic proportions. I mean, there's so much more to all of that. So thinking about, the kinds of, and I already heard you say, so, you know, it's always, it depends, right? Or it's very individualized. So there's not just one set of advice that you might give parents, but what are the kinds of things that you look at for an individual that might fall under the PDA criteria? What kinds of things might people do to begin helping them move in the right direction in terms of supporting their children? And I do think that the understanding piece is critically important. Like, I'm a huge proponent of like a little bit of brain science goes a really long way in looking at yourself differently, looking at your behavior differently, and looking at behavior of others differently. Like even just acknowledging like not all behavior is a choice. Like that's huge.
Yeah.
But often that's the prevailing thought. Like you're making bad choices. You need to make better choices. I'm going to give you an incentive to help you make that better choice. So where are some of the places that you start with all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one concept around that brain science is talking about the idea of neuroception,
Mhm.
right? Which is sort of beneath our awareness, our body is reacting to its environment. It's reacting to different cues, to our sensory information that's coming in. And we can kind of get hijacked by our nervous system sometimes when our body perceives a threat. I often tell a story. I'll tell it very quickly
Yeah,
here.
yeah, yeah, oh, by all means.
Is that, my teenage son at one point said, Mom, I have some money saved up and I want to buy something on Amazon. Can you like facilitate this with your credit card? And I said, sure, what is it? And he said, it's an Amazon death whistle. And I was like, what? I don't know what that is. And we looked it up, and it is, in fact, this sort of clay chunk whistle thing. And when you blow through it, it mimics the sound of a human scream, like a somebody's chasing, an axe murderer chasing me kind of scream. And we sort of talked about where it's appropriate to use this and how it could really scare somebody, and came up with some ground rules. And it's his money, so I said, okay, look, you can have it. So we ordered this thing and it comes in the mail, and I was like, oh, your package arrived. And I sat in the same room with him, and I watched him sort of open the tape on the package and take out the bubble wrap, and it's in a little velvet bag, and he's unwrapping this whole thing, and I know he's about to blow in it, and I knew what the sound would sound like. And yet when he blew in it, I had a huge full body reaction. Like all my hair stood on end. In fact, when I recall it and tell the story, I sort of get goosebumps all over again, because my body is remembering that
No,
moment. My
gotcha.
heart started pounding, my stomach
Mhm.
did some stuff. Like I really got hijacked in my
Right.
nervous system, even though cognitively I knew that nobody in the room was in danger and it was this whistle, but I still had this full body reaction. And so, this idea of neuroception, that our body is constantly taking in cues from the environment and deciding whether or not we're safe,
Right.
and that kids often get cues that make their bodies and their nervous system determine that they're not safe. And that's it's the perception of their nervous system. It may or may not be a real threat, just like that whistle was not any threat to me, but my body reacted as if there was a threat in the room with me. And so this is a good place of understanding, I think, because this is sort of the response that we see, and a lot of the behaviors that we see come from something invisible that's
Mhm.
happening, and oftentimes we're not even aware that
Right.
our body is sort of going into this reactivity mode. So that's one place that I sort of start with parents and professionals, and thinking about kids, is really understanding, this idea. And Mona De La Hook has written a ton about the idea of top down versus bottom up responses. So is this
Mhm.
something that's coming from the top parts of your brain, your thinking brain, your rational brain, your cognition, or is this something that's coming up from your nervous system and your sort of survival instinct? And you can't use those kinds of rewards and punishment. They don't work on
Right.
bottom up
Right. Right.
behaviors. They
Right.
only work on top down behaviors. And so really beginning to tease out and notice the difference. Like, what are the things that you're seeing that are top down versus bottom up? And we need to respond to those differently.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and so keep going with that. We need to respond to those differently because and what happens? So I mean, just in the spirit of the conversation here. I mean, what happens when that person becomes dysregulated because their threat detection system has detected threat? And again, as you say, that's not cognitive. They're not thinking, looking around, going, "Huh, this looks unsafe." It is our nervous system, our body. It may be an internal sensation that has left us to feel unsafe, and then, of course, what happens in our brain? What happens to our prefrontal cortex?
Right.
That goes offline, right? So
Yeah.
so these cognitive responses aren't working for kids,
Right.
right? So
That is not the time
yeah,
to be like,
yeah.
"Do you understand what you just did? You have to stop doing that, because if you do that, he's gonna be upset, or you're gonna get a bad grade," or, any of those sort of
Mhm.
consequences. That conversation is not useful in the moment. And that feels really like new and different information for
Mhm.
most parents, most educators. The
Yeah.
idea that we can speak to that prefrontal cortex, we can speak to that cognition later on, maybe when this kid is regulated. But
Mm.
in the moment, what they need is help getting to a more regulated state, and that's a nervous system approach, and that those can be sensory supports. It can
So
be you know, offering a cold drink of water or offering some movement, or even just sitting in proximity on the floor next to that kid and you do some deep breathing so that you have sort of enough regulation for your nervous system to absorb from them and them to absorb from you, and sort of you come meet in the middle somewhere.
So really kind of laying the foundations for kind of that co-regulation, right? So
Yes.
here we have a dysregulated child. And of course, what's not going to help is for us to kind of catch their dysregulation, which can happen, right?
Yeah,
A
sure.
dysregulated child can lead us to be dysregulated. But, if we're able to keep ourselves regulated, and then, by, like you said, by doing things like, even being with, it doesn't mean that you're even doing something, just sitting on the floor and being with can have a
Yeah.
tremendous impact, right?
Yeah.
So that helps you. I mean, if you can kind of help to share your calm, that kind of helps them to get to a point where the child can begin to regulate. And of course, beginning to regulate, what's going to happen with their brain, their
Yeah. Yeah,
cortex is
and
going to come back
that
online.
that doesn't come intuitively to
Right.
those of us who are raised differently. I was actually chatting with some teachers this morning about a particular student, and they were trying to figure out ways to support when he got dysregulated. And she said, "Oh, well, maybe I'm just going to tell him to just look me in the eye. Just
Right.
look at me. I'm right here." And then, not do any talking about all the stuff. And I thought, well, you're making a demand on him to look you
Right.
in the eye because it helps you feel more comfortable that he's connecting with you. But actually, that might just be more dysregulating to this particular
That's right. That's
kid.
right. That's right.
So
And of
instead
course,
of giving him another command to look you
yeah,
in the eye, perhaps you might just offer to him that you're there, or that,
that's right. That's
that
right.
he's safe, or
Yeah.
just take
Yeah.
nice, calm, deep breathing next to him, or validate him in some way. You don't need to.
Validate. Yeah. Well, sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
you don't need
Validate.
to, but that doesn't come intuitively. It's not the
Right.
go-to, and
Right.
it takes some practice.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Take some practice. Yeah. And of course, as you're giving that example and, the look me in the eye, of course, that instantly kind of, hits me in here because I'm thinking how often we see that happening with individuals and let's take neurodivergent individuals where eye contact may not only be difficult, maybe actually physically painful or threatening to somebody. So, we've got to be aware of that as well. We've got to be aware of,
Absolutely.
kind of our own, our own thoughts and expectations. But let's tease a little bit more about demands because one of the things that we find in the work that we do around restraint and seclusion is, of course, we find that kids that are more likely to be physically restrained and secluded are kids that are already more likely to have experienced trauma, already more likely to have kind of that more sensitive neuroception, right? More likely to sense threat when maybe there's none, more likely to be hypervigilant, more likely to have distress behaviors. And very often when kids have distress behaviors, the viewpoint is of them as misbehaviors, not stress behaviors. And then what comes are demands.
Yeah.
And demands,
Yeah.
people often don't realize, are escalating, not de-escalating a situation. So talk to me a little bit about demands because I mentioned you reading that one book recently, Low Demand Parenting, but I think I've long had this idea that when someone is having a difficult time, is not the time to be piling a lot of demands on them, is not the time to be forcing them to be compliant. It's the time to co-regulate and to be there and be with. But very often that's the approach.
Yes.
So talk to me about demands. I mean, how do you help people, whether parents or educators, to kind of shift that mindset? Because that's the natural go-to is like, okay, mister, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, you're going to sit there, and escalate, fight or flight.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that a little.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I talk a lot with parents about what it means to drop demands and what it means to shift your ideas about what things are really necessary and what things you can maybe let go of. I mean, Ross Green in his work,
Mhm.
if folks are
Mhm.
familiar with the CPS model, really talks about sort of, are there some things that he calls it plan C, like
Right.
this is an expectation that isn't the thing I'm most worried about right now. So I'm going to intentionally let it go so that we can work on the things that are really bubbling up to the top that feel the most difficult and the most problematic for our family or our classroom or, whichever it is. And so, dropping demands is an intentional and sometimes really challenging
Yeah. Yeah.
road to go down. A lot of people think,
Mhm.
oh, it's just kind of this loosey-goosey, let it all hang out kind of approach. But it's actually, in many ways, it's more labor intensive, I think, than having those sort of behavior charts and star charts and things like that, because you have to be really thoughtful and you have to dig deep internally to think about what your values are and what the things are that are really important to you. And
Mhm.
so yeah, I mean, there is a time, I think there's a threshold, right, over which you can sort of sometimes, even though we're a little bit stressed, we can push through and do a thing, right? Like I was a
Mhm.
little
Mhm.
anxious about this conversation today and wasn't sure exactly what we were talking about, what this was going to be.
I
And so I
told you
was
we
like,
would have fun. Aren't you having fun yet?
yes, totally,
Good, good,
totally.
good, good.
Um, but so I had like a little bit of anxiety, but
Yeah.
it was the kind of anxiety that I can push through and can
Right.
motivate me and move me forward, right? And
Right.
then there's times where I'm at my tipping point and I'm going to tip over into some other kind of fight or flight state or a frozen state, right? And
Mhm.
so I think the job of the adults around these kids is to be able to sort of identify where that tipping point is and where that threshold is. Where are the moments when this kid is able to sort of stretch and meet certain expectations? And then when are the times when that's not important because regulation comes first? And if we
Mhm.
push this kid and pile more demands and expectations on top of them, they're gonna melt down, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, it's about, I often say, and I know lots of people say, you need to be a thermometer and a thermostat, right? So you're sort of judging, what the stress level is, what that window of tolerance is,
Right. Right.
how stable and grounded and connected and safe this kid is feeling in this moment. When we feel connected and safe, that's when we can take risks.
Right. I love that you just brought up kind of the window of tolerance idea, which and you've said this already. Like stress is normal. Stress is natural. Stress helps us get things done through our daily lives. We go through states where we feel a little stress, we feel a little anxiety, and the idea with regulation is not that you're always calm, not that you're always regulated, but that you're kind of moving in and out of states, right? That you're moving in, and it's about what's tolerable stress. What is so significant that it might push us into a fight or flight response. It doesn't mean that we're always calm, that we're always regulated, but again, knowing that there's a threshold, and sometimes our adult demands are the things that are pushing a child over their threshold. And I mean, I even find with demands, and as a parent as well, and one that learned many things on my own journey. I had to like ask myself tough questions, right? Like, why is this really important to me? Like,
Yeah.
what about this demand is important? And is it really important right now? I mean, even if it might be important, and giving, kind of, um, giving up a demand in a moment doesn't mean that demand is not something that's important, but sometimes it means not right now, not right now. It doesn't have to be a priority. And you kind of got to this a couple of times, but the regulation first piece, right? Um, we're not going to make progress if we're continuing to de-escalate rather than help a child who needs to. I always like the analogy of like a kid that's becoming dysregulated. Like they need to borrow our well-regulated prefrontal cortex,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They need our help to get them there. But this is not natural. You're right. So again, I want to keep with parents for a second. Then we're gonna kind of shift over to talking about educators. Um, so you've talked about some of the things that you might be doing to help parents in their journey. What about, and I'm just kind of curious, what do you tell them in terms of helping them to not only understand this, but to be gentle on themselves? And this is really important. I mean, I think sometimes by the time somebody gets to needing more help, and they might get to working with someone like you, they've often been through a lot.
Yeah.
They feel judged, they feel like failures, they feel like, so how do you help a parent also reflect on that? Because we've also got to be in our cortex to be able to help others.
Yeah.
So do you have anything to share about that when you're coaching parents, how you kind of
Yeah.
help them on this journey?
It's true. There's so much pain, and so many people, by the time they find me, they've been fed a lot of, ideas around everything is their fault. They're parenting wrong. They're not doing it hard enough or with fidelity enough, or, and a lot of schools being like, oh, your kid did this, and this. Here, take them home, keep them home for however many days, and bring them back and have them be different, and that's like repeated kind of information coming at you over and over again is traumatizing.
Right.
We talk about this as a trauma response in kids, but parents are mirroring that with their own responses to how it feels like gaslighting almost, and particularly sometimes these kids can do really well in school and they're kind of masking in school and holding it together all day. And the stress is building, building, building. And then they come home and they let it fly at home. And then parents really get blamed because everybody's like, well, they're fine at school. I don't know what your problem is at home. So yeah, it's true that there's a lot of pain. And, I think one thing that has been incredibly helpful for me, because I've had those experiences as well as a parent, is finding community. And so one thing that I do that's sort of my volunteer work is I partner with PDA North America to run support groups and bring parents together so that they know that they're not alone. And I just started a new support group, actually just finished right before we came into this meeting today, with a new group of parents. And it's so powerful for parents to know that they're not alone in this, and that there's other folks who are going through similar kinds of struggles, because from what we understand, the percentage of kids who fit this particular profile, if we're talking about this PDA profile, is pretty small, and out of all the kids who are diagnosed autistic, which probably there's many people who are not even diagnosed autistic, those who sort of fit within this profile of autism is something like 4 or 5%. Don't quote me on that, but it's a pretty small number. And so parents can feel so lonely. And I think that's part of why I'm drawn to this work, because I want them to know that I've been there too. And I've gotten all those messages too. And I've made mistakes in my own parenting and done things and followed advice that was probably traumatizing to my own kid, including leading to school situations where there was seclusion and restraint, and a lot of, scary, dark moments that came out of that. So, I'm starting from a place of really validating and understanding this is tough work. Our kids are so brilliant and hilarious and fun and also really complicated. And they are really challenging to parent, because it really demands this really kind of radical shift in approach. And that takes a lot of courage.
A couple things. The first thing I want to hit is you were talking a moment ago, and I was trying to remember the terminology, and I think the term that's been used is after-school restraint collapse. This idea that kids are holding it together. I mean, there's a name for it, right? I mean, kids are holding it together all day long, and then of course what happens is parents often get blamed. A lot of what you just said resonated with me. I mean, one of the reasons that I started the Alliance when I did was similar to some of the reason that you had shared why you're doing some of this work. When I started the Alliance, I started it in part because I wanted people that were going through this to know they weren't alone, right? It's really difficult when as you said, and I think looking at something like the PDA profile, where, as a parent of a child that might be, you might have a neurodivergent child, you might have a child that's getting special education service. You're already a smaller subset of the population, right? So you've got a smaller community of people that might understand you. But then in our case, when you're talking about a kid that's actually been restrained and secluded, it's even a small, and even the people that understood you before don't understand you now. But finding your community, and that's again one of the things that I value most about our community here at the Alliance, is that it's so powerful to be able to connect with people. One of the other things you said that was really interesting to me is you're talking about kind of the smaller, looking at the PDA profile, but on what I know of your approach and what I know of PDA, one of the things I would say, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but honestly, I think the approach that you might take with a child that is under the PDA profile could benefit a lot of children, especially a lot of neurodivergent children. I think the same kinds of approaches, regardless of what. Regardless, I know, a lot of individuals with ADHD that this a similar kind of approach, and I always think that brain aligned approach, that trauma informed approach, that, sometimes reducing the demand approach. All of those things. What are your thoughts? Are the same kinds of approaches helpful to others?
Yeah. I think these approaches are helpful for all kids, right?
Right.
Coming from this lens of regulation and also giving kids the opportunity to make decisions for themselves. Part of this is around autonomy and agency, right?
Amen.
And as I said, there's not a ton of research out there on PDA. Most of what I have learned about PDA has been from adult autistic advocates who identify as PDA themselves. And I listen very deeply to their stories, and I'm always trying to learn more. And then, of course, from all of the parents who I've worked with, as well as my own lived experience as a parent. But a big piece of what folks recommend for these kids is providing opportunities for agency and making their own choices and making their own decisions. And I think that that's hugely important for all kids. I think we want our kids to grow up and be able to live their own lives and make decisions for themselves. They need to practice that, and they maybe need to sometimes make some bad choices and know what that feels like. And
Alfie Cohen has a great quote about this, and I'm not going to get it right, but it's essentially kind of the idea of, how do kids learn to make good decisions? It's not by having a reward or having a consequence. It's by making decisions, right?
Right, exactly.
And you probably know, but I'm not a big proponent of a lot of the compliance-based focus that we have in education. There's so much focus on compliance, and I'll tell you, and you would probably agree, out of all the parents and all the people that I talk to day in and day out, and I say, what do you want for your child? What are your dreams? I can't tell you that anybody's ever said, I want a compliant child.
Right.
Of course we want kids that can work with others and get along with others. And that's great. But really a lot of our systems are very focused on compliance. And I think that's to a detriment. I think that, when you're too focused on compliance, you're not getting kind of, in fact, many of the kids that we find that are on the wrong side of a lot of these punitive things, restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, all these things. Many of these are kids that actually are probably somewhat non-compliant, but are also kids that are questioning things and that are pushing back. And some of these kids will change the world.
Absolutely.
That focus. Yeah. And I have one. My son's one of those kids that, and I so value that, but very much a lot of what we do and a lot of our thoughts around children in general, I think are dated. I think that, autonomy and, if we wouldn't do something to an adult, I don't think we should be doing it to a child. But there's still a lot of values around raising children that look at children as somehow having fewer human rights.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's so important. As I said, these kids are really wired to really need that autonomy and kind of demand it. But all kids, neurodivergent or not, need to sort of understand who they are and what their comfort zones are and where they can push themselves, and they should be able to be somewhat self-driven, hopefully by the time they reach adulthood. So how do you get to be self-driven? You practice being self-driven by being given a little bit more agency by the adults around you. And that's not really how our at least our school systems typically are built. There are some like really radical groovy schools out there, but for the most part, our education system is not built to give kids those opportunities.
Yeah. And that's a change that needs to happen. And I need a lot of partners in making that happen, but one day, right? Listen, I want to get to a couple of comments and questions here because we got a couple things that have been piling up in the chat, and it's not hard for me to just, start, just have a fun, good time with the conversation. Then we're like, oh gosh, I'm missing all these. So just a couple things. Jennifer said, being with is powerful. Absolutely agree. Also said people so often have no idea how often they place a demand on another. Well, we need to stop shouldering on others. And I think you're right. I mean, very often there are demands that people don't even realize are being placed as demands. Valerie loves one of your quotes here. When we feel connected and safe, that's when we can take risk. Fantastic. Sandra says, as a parent, one of the hardest parts of co-regulating with my child is the time it takes. It's not always convenient. And when that happens, I have to check myself. It's hard when a child is dysregulated and we have to schedule. We have a schedule we need to stick with, such as school, doctor's appointments. When I can let that expectation go, that we will just be late or we'll have to change our plans, things go so much better for all of us. So really just kind of a comment on their experience, but is this something you see?
Yeah, that's maybe the hugest thing. And I think sometimes it requires us as adults maybe shifting our priorities a little bit. And it's really the pandemic sort of aided in some ways people in rethinking their priorities and understanding how they want to spend their time. And I think that comes up in parenting a lot too, is really reevaluating. I have this work schedule, I have this appointment, I have these places to go, and I'm one of these people. I don't like being late. The pressure of being late stresses me out, and and so how can I build a world in which I'm not rushing all the time from place to place, or making my commute time shorter, all these different things that can
we need to drop some of the demands on ourselves sometimes too.
Right. We need to sometimes as parents make shifts in our lives so that we can open that space up to sort of have more flexibility with our kids. Like, we're not going to get out the door on time. And if that's not that big of a crisis for you as the parent, then you can co-regulate with the kid. But if there's really high stakes for you as a parent, you can't help but pass your anxiety on to the kid, which just makes them escalate even more. And so I think, I can't remember whose name it was who sent in that, Valerie, was it maybe, who put in that comment? I think you're spot on, that all those pressures of everyday life really do make it so much more challenging to be there for our kids. And sometimes we can make shifts and change those things, and sometimes we really can't, right?
Yeah. So, and we all become dysregulated, and we all have a window of tolerance. And we all need to recognize that. And we also need to be forgiving to ourselves as well, that, our body, our stress response system is doing what it was designed to do. Sometimes that may come at a little bit of a cost that, we become dysregulated, but it really is about our body is designed to keep us safe. And sometimes we have a stress response, that may make it difficult. Let me keep going through a couple of these comments here. Sandra had another one. And I find with teachers, they are also bound to a schedule, and a dysregulated child who needs time to regulate is simply not convenient, causing escalation and stress for both the child and the teacher. This is a multi-parter here, Sandra. Okay. I've lost count with how many times people accuse me of letting my child get away with things. This is a good one. I want to touch on this a little bit. When I'm prioritizing co-regulation, it wasn't until I practiced co-regulation enough that I felt confident in what I was doing to help my child. Great point. And I want to ask you about that, because you certainly have a lot of experience working with schools as well. And, here's something I found. One, there are more and more people that are beginning to get some of this knowledge, which is great, but it is by far not mainstream. People having awareness of kind of the brain and bottom-up behaviors and top-down behaviors, it is not common. There are certainly some really strong pockets of people that are out there, and they're in Dr. Lori's cohorts, and they're reading Mona Delahooke's books and all of that, but it's not common. And so a lot of the prevailing thoughts look around behavior as all being intentional, all being a matter of choice. So the interventions are rewards and punishments. But then I might find that an administrator has really been digging into this and gets it. and a kid is sent to the administrator, and the administrator works on regulating the kid. And to the teacher, they say, "Oh, it's just a reward. They just get to go and have candy with the principal." And then they feel like you didn't do anything and there was no consequence. So, I think this point that's being brought up here is a really good point, that there's perceptions by other parents, by educators, about letting kids get away with things. Tell me about, kind of with your career in education, the things that you do. How do you educate people, and how do you get people to see things differently?
Yeah, it's a huge shift in thinking, and it is very hard to, even if you can kind of get there, sometimes it's hard to stay there, right? Because it's so internalized and ingrained within us, this idea of, you're rewarding the bad behavior when you offer a kid some quiet space or a drink of water, or, to play basketball or whatever it is, right? That to regulate them, it feels like actually you're rewarding them for the behavior that they just exhibited. And that is coming from that top down idea that they decided to behave in such a way, and that they planned it out, and it was, a decision that they made, as opposed to a reaction that their body was having. And it's a difficult shift, and it's hard, even if you have one or two teachers on board, that doesn't kind of go all the way. You kind of need the community to embrace some of these ideas and begin to shift. And it takes time, and it's not easy. And the other piece is, it is true that a teacher has a job to do. They have lots of pressure to meet different standards, and testing and attendance and all these other pressures that get passed down onto them. And when they have a student whose behavior is disrupting the classroom, like that creates a problem for them. And they often don't have the bandwidth to sit and co-regulate with that child while they need to be, schools are oftentimes not designed to meet the needs of all the kids in the classroom. And then on top of that, you had the added layer of, well, this kid just really irritated me and pushed my buttons, and now I'm pissed, right? And then I can't co-regulate with them because I'm irritated and I feel all of this pressure. And so a lot of the work, when I go into schools, we start talking about teacher, the adult nervous system, and what are the things that they can access during the school day and outside of the school day to sort of, as we've said again, expand your window of tolerance. The catchphrase I always use is Q-tip, quit taking it personally. Like, is there a way that I don't know where I got it from. It wasn't mine originally, but I've been saying it for many years now. Like, this is your cue. Like, you have to cue yourself to not go there with the student who does something that pushes your buttons, right? How do you stay? Because nobody who's dysregulated can co-regulate with someone, right? Like, you have to find a way to stay in a place of regulation. And that's a tall order, because teachers have a lot on their plates. And so really it's about community, self-care, or whatever you want to call it, but like really having a community of people who are working together to prioritize adult nervous system regulation, self-awareness, and that is a big shift that takes time. It's not an overnight change.
And it's a cultural shift that needs to happen within the schools. I mean, these things that you can do to improve outcomes for kids aren't just about the kids. They're about the teachers and staff too, right? So being trauma-informed means not just being trauma-informed towards kids, but being trauma-informed towards the educators, being trauma-informed towards parents. Co-regulation is not just important for kids, but, how could educators help each other through co-regulation? Rather than, even administrators, how instead of escalating an educator, might you help them through co-regulation? We've seen educators do things that, of course, you were in the program with Lori, the Applied Educational Neuroscience program. Have seen some people do some really amazing things. Had a educator that had set up calm corners that weren't for kids, but they were for educators. Like, what can we do to take care of the adult nervous system, which is so important in terms of supporting supporting each other and supporting children. So, that's a piece that sometimes is left out. I mean, it's really critical. I mean, we can't expect well-regulated adults that are going to be able to help kids if we're not doing things and focusing on how do we support the adults in the classroom? How do we help adults understand that all of this applies to them? All of this brain science that applies to kids applies to all of them as well.
All humans.
Yep. Yep. Valerie said, I wonder if, and I have an answer for this, but I'll let you go first. I wonder if the nervous system responses of PDA children to demands put them at a higher risk of restraint and seclusion.
Oh, I think absolutely.
Yeah, I know.
100%.
Yep. Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And, especially again, when you're talking about demand avoidance. So when you're talking about, I can't tell you how often, although some states do have high standards, many don't, but the standard in some states is that you don't do restraint or seclusion unless it's a situation that involves imminent serious physical harm, that it's a potentially life-threatening situation. Yet, we often see that what begins as a demand escalates. So, if a demand to do a worksheet escalates into a physical restraint, like there was a whole lot of opportunity between that demand and when a restraint happened, that things could have gone a different way. But it's not uncommon. It's for, that it happens for non-compliance and disrespect and minor behavior.
Yeah, and it can escalate so quickly. And there's this terminology used in ABA therapy called extinction burst.
Yep.
And the idea is that if a kid starts acting up when you ask them to do their math, you can't ease up on the pressure, because then they learn that whining or complaining or rolling on the floor or whatever they're doing will get them. It's this very behaviorist kind of approach, and so that you can't release the pressure. Well, what happens when you don't release the pressure is oftentimes you see aggression, right? You see explosive behaviors, you see screaming, yelling, meltdowns, throwing chairs, etc. Right? And then those are the moments when you see that those seclusion and restraint practices put in place, when really there was a moment when somebody could have moved away from further activating and towards an accommodation that helped that kid feel, safe and connected. I always go back to safe and connected, because that is when kids can do hard things. That's right.
That's right. So, Absolutely. I mean, I think back to the very simple things that I learned as a parent that were transformative, rather than when things were escalated, raising my voice and taking a step forward, lowering my voice, taking a step backwards, the things that we do, have so much influence over what happens next. But, very often, I mean, that idea, and you probably know what I think about a lot of behaviorism and a lot of compliance-based approaches. I mean, it's absolutely the wrong thing to do. But that idea, that terminology, that approach is used in many schools across the country. We're looking at this behavior through a lens of, well, it's manipulative and it's attention seeking and it's all of these other things, and not really looking at the stress system below the surface and really trying to figure out what's going on. And that is so harmful to so many.
It really is. And I think that the adults working with kids, whether they're, an aide or a teacher or a camp counselor or so forth, we all want to seem like we're proficient at what we're supposed to do. We all want to seem competent. And I think when there are behaviors that feel challenging, the adult feels like, well, in order to show that I'm a competent teacher, after school staff, whatever it is, I need to control this. Right. And so they are getting activated themselves. And that's why they get louder or get, more threatening or intimidating, or all these different things, the step towards and raise the voice, as opposed to step back and lower the voice, because they have the pressure of what other people will think of them in terms of their, everybody's got our insecurities. And so there's layers to it. And I think when you're talking about that cultural shift, it feels so important that everyone in the building understands that what we're going to try when we see this escalation happening is we're going to try to work towards de-escalation through nervous system regulation. We're going to take that step back. We're going to lower our voice. That's our go-to. It's not me being lax. It's not me, letting the kid get away with murder. It's not, any of those things. It's working towards not having this blow up into really a scary situation.
Yep, absolutely. A couple more comments here. Sarah said, my child fits the PDA profile. So certainly dig deeper. Just ask you, if you're a parent and you suddenly have this, gosh, we're watching this and maybe my child fits the PDA. Are there resources? Are there books? Are there things that you would point a parent to? And I know we mentioned one of them, PDA North America, and we shared the website earlier. But what other resources might you point somebody to if they're kind of like, hey, this is interesting and this may be aligned with what's going on?
Yeah, there didn't used to be almost any books, but now there's actually quite a few books out there. I think on the PDA North America website, there's probably a list. I don't want to spend a lot of time listing books and authors there. And, there are folks doing a lot of cool stuff on social media as well. Casey Elric from At Peace Parents puts out a lot of good content. Christy Forbes, who's out of Australia, puts out a lot of good content.
Right.
And there's podcasts, I think, especially on tilt parenting. There's a number of podcasts. So there's and I certainly have some information on my website as well. And I do coaching with parents. And so there are resources out there more and more every day in the US. You used to kind of have to go overseas to get a lot of that stuff. And more of us now are able to have this conversation in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned you. I sit on the board of PDA North America, and over the last year, I mean, it's just really blossomed, and they've got a tremendous community of volunteers that have been helping them to put out more and more information. And I believe actually Diane is working on a book as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, great.
There's a lot going on there for sure. A couple more comments here. Sandra says blind compliance is dangerous for children. Yes. We must teach children how to recognize when their body feels unsafe. Absolutely. Forcing compliance requires them to ignore those threat detections in their body, which could cause them to get hurt. Absolutely. And could make them more vulnerable to abuse. There's a lot of things that happen when we do that.
Absolutely.
And then I've got a comment here from Jennifer. Oh gosh, the comments just keep on coming here. We've created a world and communities that have not considered the need for our younger citizens. And we were talking about this earlier, and have lost our way as to what even basic needs our kids have. No one does this well under all this stress. Yeah, I think that's a great point. All right, so I'm just taking a look here. And just seeing what else we have here. Okay, so we've actually been through an hour already, believe it or not. And I told you this would go quickly, and for me it has at least. So let's just shift a little bit in the last few minutes, and we'll give people an opportunity to ask some more questions if they have them. But you've been working in schools for some time as well. You have personal experience, and from my own experience, where I know individuals who have been parents of, let's say, neurodivergent children and worked in the schools, the two things didn't always mesh real well. I'm judging from that look that you're gonna. So tell me a little bit about that, and tell me a little bit about kind of the challenges that you had in terms of trying to bring these things together, because I know that your work today not only focuses on parents, but also on professionals. So tell me a little bit about your journey with that, if you would.
Sure. I mean, people think New York City is big, but my worlds were colliding a lot when my son was younger, and sort of trying to figure out appropriate schools and avenues. And yeah, it was tough to ride those two things at the same time of working in public. At one point I was working in a public school, in a middle school that was in the same building as the elementary school that my child was attending. It was not a good look. So yeah, I think those things can really, particularly the public school system in New York City is such a behemoth. There are so many schools and so many school children, and it's such a huge bureaucracy that it's hard to make change and make that cultural shift. And yet, when I'm invited into these spaces to have these conversations, with teachers and guidance counselors and administrators, people are very receptive. People are very excited to learn these things. And I sometimes I supervise social work interns, and it blows my mind that even the social workers are not getting this content around
Mhm.
understanding sort of
Right.
the neuroscience and in a social work program.
And we've got a higher ed problem here. We absolutely do. Higher ed is lagging, and any of you out there in higher ed, we need to change this.
Yeah, so
Our
it's just
teacher
it's
programs,
not
our social worker programs, our behavioral programs are decades behind.
And it's not that people aren't open to it or even excited about hearing
Right.
the science and understanding and shifting. It's just that it hasn't been part of their training and it hasn't been part of the status quo for so long. But when I get out there and am able to work with school staff, educators, people who are working with kids, mental health staff, you name it, by and large, they're with me. There's always
Mhm.
some questions and some
Right.
things to grapple with and some things that feel hard to shift. But in theory, they take this framework and they grab hold of it and it makes sense.
Mhm.
So, that feels really hopeful to me. And it's just a question of continuing the work and getting the word out there.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, no, and in fact, it's kind of funny because I was thinking as you were beginning this question about another question I was going to ask you, which was about what gives you hope. And it sounds like, I mean, it sounds like you are feeling a little bit more hopeful, and that's fantastic because I think, depending on where you are, this varies quite a bit. There are places that I think are doing more work moving forward, but across the country, there is a lot of there's a lot of difference between school districts.
Sure.
And even in a state, there is often a significant amount of difference between school districts. And this is really tough. So let's bring those worlds together for a second and say, as someone working with families who may have children that are neurodivergent, they may have children that fit a PDA profile. Um, what are some of the things that you share with them to help them bring some of this back to their school? So if I'm a parent and I've come and seen you, and at first you started to turn a light on, and it's like, okay, here comes something else, and then it starts to go on, and then suddenly I'm like, oh, okay, I see this. So as a parent that maybe has started on this journey and is beginning to see the power of what you're talking about here, I can change what I'm doing as a parent. But let's say that a lot of the issues that we're having are happening in a school environment. What is your guidance for a parent that might be trying to navigate a school system to better support their child?
Yeah, it can be tough. And I think as much as we are looking for and pushing toward this sort of big cultural shift and a shift in our society, we're not there yet. I feel
Right,
like we're moving towards it. We're getting
right,
there, right?
right.
And people are learning to talk about ability in the same in the same way, and diversity in neurotypes in the same way that we're able to talk about diversity in race and gender and other things. We're starting to learn that
And of
conversation.
course, we're not as far along there as we should be either.
Yes,
As
no, no,
I sometimes
exactly,
find
exactly.
out when I hear
Yes.
people's opinions, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of scary. I thought we had moved in a better direction. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's true.
yeah.
That's true. And I think those things are moving forward in some parts of the country, maybe more
Mm,
than others. But that nobody can wait for that when my kid
mhm.
is really struggling. And
Right.
so my advice in the here and now is just, if you can you find one ally? Can you find one person in the
Mm,
school who sees the things that are amazing about your kid, because there are no doubt some really cool things about your kid, somebody who can see those things and not just tolerate your child, but really embrace them,
mhm, mhm, mhm.
um, and and see where that person can support you. Are they able or willing to find ways of being flexible,
Mm,
of building in more opportunities for co-regulation, of letting kids take breaks on their own without having to do it in a punitive way? Is
mhm,
there,
mhm.
ways that we can build in opportunities for agency and autonomy so that kid feels safer and more connected at school?
Mhm, mhm,
So I
mhm.
think, just starting, it's a great if you have a whole team of people who are on the same wavelength as you, but sometimes you just got to start with one person who you feel like kind of gets
Mhm.
your kid and wants to work with you, and then it can kind of spread out from there.
Yeah, and it sure would be nice if that person happened to be on your IEP team too.
It sure would.
It sure would be nice to have an ally in that. That can be a tough world. I've also been known to do this myself and also recommended to others. But giving members of an IEP team a copy of Mona Dello Hook's book, Beyond Behaviors, or
Sure.
getting something that might help them to begin to look at things through a different lens. I mean, I'm a real strong believer that if you begin looking through kind of a brain aligned lens around this, once you do, it's really hard to see it a different way. I mean, and once you see it in that different way, you look at your own behavior, you look at the behavior of others in such a different light. And you realize, I mean, you said it earlier, it's gotta start with that regulation, right? If we're in fact, Jennifer was on here earlier. Jennifer is a volunteer with us, but somebody I've known for probably almost as long as I've been involved in the Alliance. Wrote a fantastic article for us a couple of years ago. The article was called "Regulation Before Education," and of course, I mean that kind of mimics what Bruce Perry says in the neurosequential model, right? It's like regulate, relate, reason, right? We don't reach those higher. Yeah, there's Jennifer. She's there. We don't reach those higher functions. We don't, have the ability to, critically think and decision making, and so many of those things that are really reliant on our cortex. If we're dysregulated, it's got to start there. But not only do we have to help kids that are dysregulated to feel regulated. Not only do we have to help them when they're having a hard time through things like co-regulation, but we also need to make sure that we're not actively dysregulating them, which is what we're so often doing with the tons of demands and the compliance, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I love that you give out that book. I don't know how many teachers are going to take the time to read it.
Right.
And so that's why I like to offer, like, here's some social media influencers you could follow. Here's a podcast or two. Here's a video, an animated video or whatever it is. I like to, when I offer those resources to teachers, understand they have their own families. They have a lot of pressure. They may or may not be able to dive into all the reading that you and I have been able to do.
Right.
And it'd be wonderful if they could, and great if their school administration, made that part of their professional development.
Sure. Yeah. Do
but
are
there some things that feel more accessible as well, where you can sort of take this in bite-sized pieces and start to shift and learn more about it in that way too?
Well, I mean, I've got a great solution. It'll only take about an hour and 15 minutes, and that is share this podcast, right? Share the discussion you and I are having today. And of course, we always encourage people to do that. I mean, I say that kind of jokingly, but we have in our audience here a lot of parents, a lot of self-advocates, a lot of teachers, administrators, paraprofessionals, social workers, psychologists. Share this with your coworkers, share this with your teams. These conversations are really important. And, again, I mean, who can't, even, but if you put on 2 times speed and listen to the podcast version, you get through it in 35 minutes. But time well spent. Well, listen, we are nearing the end of our time here. And as I said, that would happen quickly. I want to, of course, thank you for being here. But before I do, I just want to see if there's any kind of final thoughts or final words. And I know suddenly it feels like a whole bunch of pressure, right? I'm sending your stress response system off here. But it doesn't have to be anything terribly profound. But any final thoughts you want to leave people with as we wrap this up today?
Oh gosh, I just think, anyone whether you're coming to this because you're concerned about seclusion and restraint, or you think your kid might fit a PDA profile, or there's a trauma history, any of those things is a lot to be carrying. And so I'm just, sending out some love and support and the knowledge that you are not alone. And just by virtue of spending time listening to this conversation, that sort of demonstrates how deeply you care. And so, give yourself that grace.
And of course, as we mentioned, you are a coach for parents and for professionals as well. And I'm gonna share your link again here right now and in the chat. And of course, you are based out of New York. Do you work with families only in New York, or with the event of COVID and now us being so proficient at other things, do you work with families across the country or even beyond that?
I do work with families outside of New York as well. I tend to end up working mostly with people in New York, Connecticut,
Mhm.
Massachusetts
Okay.
area, but I
Okay.
certainly have some clients, time zones and things like that get tricky. But I do have some clients outside of the sort of Northeast as well. So yeah, I'm pretty open.
Okay, great. Well, we provided your link here, so hopefully people can find you if they're interested in learning more. I want to thank you for spending, the last 75 minutes with me today. Even if, going into it, there was a little bit of stress. I always enjoy these conversations, and I think they're really powerful. I think, having these conversations, talking about what we can do to, better, I mean, honestly, not only serve kids, but adults and educators and so many. I'm one of those people that has this belief, and sometimes people tell me I'm too optimistic, and I don't believe that. But that the same things that we do to do better for kids can really end up doing better for the adults and everyone else involved.
Agreed.
So I really appreciate you taking the time to join me here today, and just
Happy
want to
to.
thank you. Yeah, thank you
Yeah,
for all you're
lots of
doing.
work. So
Yep.
appreciate it.
Yep. And all you continue to do. So with that, you can stick around here, but we will let everybody else go. Those of you that have joined us live, thanks for watching. If you're watching this back on recording, thank you for getting through it, and please share it and come back and see us again in 2 weeks. All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.